With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Chav Dalid. We began the Braisa on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, where we have a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda regarding someone who asa'a labehema doifen l'sukkah. A person uses a living animal to serve as one wool or more for one sukkah. So Rabbi Meir poisel and Rabbi Yehuda machsher. And up until now on Daf Chav Gimel, we had a machlokes amoraim between Abaye and Abzeda as to what's the reason behind Rabbi Meir. They both understand that Rabbi Meir's invalidating that as a wall is a rabbinic invalidation, and Abaye understands that the reason why Rabbi Meir says that a living animal cannot serve as a wall, because the animal might die shemot tammuz, and if the animal will die, it's going to collapse and it won't have the minimum height of 10 tfachim. With all of the pratim that we learned on Daf Chav Gimel, that indeed, if it's a very large animal, like if it's an elephant, even if it turns into a carcass, it will still have the minimum height. According to Rabbi Meir, according to Abaye, it's going to be good. And Rabbi Yehuda, obviously, that holds that it's machsher, because Rabbi Yehuda doesn't take into account that remote possibility that punkt over sukkahs, the animal is going to die. In other words, whether you're chayish lemisa or not, according to Abaye, this is subject to the machlokes between Ameir and Rabbi Yehuda. Problem is, we no longer have a question on Abaye. But if that's the understanding of Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda in the machlokes regarding using an animal as a doifen for a sukkah, we have the braisa that we learned on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis regarding someone who buys wine from Kutim. And the way we learned until now, the machlokes between Rabbi Meir on one side and other Tanoim, including Rabbi Yehuda on the other side, is that Rabbi Meir allows for someone to make a verbal designation, and only after Shabbos, if that's going to be the case, then can you physically separate it? And what's the chiddush that we're not chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid? We're not afraid that maybe the wineskin is going to burst and break. Rabbi Yehuda, who does not allow that verbal designation to happen, is because Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Shimon, they are chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid. And the Gemara until now was making this correlation because there is a link here. If you're chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid, that aligns with shema tammuz. If you don't take into account the possibility of shema tammuz, that's because it should be that you don't take into account the possibility that this wineskin is going to burst open. And now we have a contradiction. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir is chayish l'misa, but Rabbi Meir is not chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid. Rabbi Yehuda, by the Braisa, who's machshir using a living animal for a doifen l'sukkah because he's not chayish l'misa. Rabbi Yehuda is chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid, and that's something that will have to be reconciled. Now, what we will have on Daf Chav Dalid is, again, we had this not that long ago, is another insight into the machlokes concerning buying wine from the Kutim, making this verbal declaration, which is linked to the question whether you subscribe to the principle known as Breira, retroactive clarification, as we'll speak out. That's something that we're going to review. And then finally, we're going to learn a third Amoid on Daf Chav Daled, which will understand that when Rab Meir says that you may not use a living animal as a wool for a sukkah, the invalidation, not like Abaye, not like Rab Zera, is not the rabbinic invalidation, but it's a biblical invalidation. And that has to do with a new principle that we'll learn today. And the principle is that kol mechitza shoim medes beruach, any partition that is only standing erect because it's filled with breath, is not called a mechitza. And we will learn various understandings into this principle. Why would we say such a thing? On Daf Chav Daled Amud Beis, we're going to go back to the Braisa of Chav Gimel. We're going to quote the other Tana that says, that addresses the question whether you may write a get on a living animal or not. And because of that, we will go and chazer. We're going to review various rules concerning the writing of a get. And on Daf Chavdalad Amid Beis, the Mishnah will begin by telling us regarding someone who built a sukkah, bein ha'ilonos. In other words, the trees will serve as walls. This is not like the sugyas that we just learned regarding building a sukkah on top of a tree. Here, the sukkah is built on the ground. Question is, can you use trees as walls for the sukkah? And don't forget, there is an isur midrabanan not to make use of a tree on Shabbos, because Gezerah Shema Yitzayr, how that will affect a sukkah that's built in between trees. And finally, very importantly, we're going to have on the Chavdalad Amud Beis the sugya known as Kol Mechitza She'ena Yechoyla La'amid Beruach Mitzuya Eina Mechitza. That means if you build the mechitza, that a usual wind will take apart the wall. Taking apart the wall doesn't only mean it's going to blow the wall down, but it's going to make the wall sway back and forwards, as it is common by many of these less expensive sukkahs, right? You have the what became normal, the metal frame and the plastic white tarp walls, and they blow in the wind. That is going to be connected to the final sugi we will have on Af Chavdalid. Let's start on Af Chavdalid Amid Aleph. We left off 4 lines from the top of the Amid. The Gemara resolved the problem we had with Abaya by re-clarifying that when Abaya was reconciling the Mishnah and the Braisa regarding a Bas Kohen who married a Kohen, whether you do suspect that the husband passed away or whether or not we understand Abaya correctly. So the question is not going to be focused on Abaya, but as we spoke on in our introduction, however, Kashya that Rav Meir. Rav Meir says in Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph that Asa'ah la behema doifim la sukkah, the sukkah is not kosher. Abaye explained why is it not kosher, because chayshin on shemot tamus. In other words, you're chayish lemisa. Rabbi Meir in the Braisa that we learned regarding buying wine, let's say right before Shabbos, making the verbal declaration now is good. Why? Because after Shabbos you will physically separate it, and you're good. And we're not chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid. These 2 opinions appear to be in conflict one with the other. Says the Gemara, Amalach Rav Meir, the following. Misa, I think Tzvika pointed that out. You can't compare one with the other. Death is shchicha. Bikiyas hanoid is loy shchicha. Even physically, these wineskins, these containers, now, unless something happened to it, just letting it be as it is, they last a lot longer than the life of an animal. Push it. And furthermore, as the Gemara says, that efshir the masar leila shomer. What will make the wineskin burst open over this Shabbos? If it's going to fall, if someone is going to throw something on it, that's something that we are able to prevent. Like, for example, give it over to a guardian. He's going to make sure that nothing happens to the wineskin. Whether an animal is going to live or not, you can have 10 guardians. It doesn't help, because the problem is something within the animal can go wrong, and that cannot be protected. So there's a higher chance. What is amazing is, again, that normally we do know that Rabbi Meir is the Tana that holds that you're Chashin and Limauta. Here we see that there are levels to the Chashin and Limauta. Rabbi Meir takes into account the minority view, but even there's a limit. And if something is even less likely, because it's within our power to see to it that it won't happen, which is the breaking of this wine utensil, then Rav Meir doesn't have such a suspicion, and thus he allows making the verbal declaration right before Shabbos. Furthermore, the Gemara says, how do you resolve Kashya de Rabbi Yehuda ad Rabbi Yehuda? Again, if we'll understand that Rabbi Yehuda and Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, that says that you are allowed to use an animal as a wall for a sukkah, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that we're not chayish shemotamus. If we'll understand that in the Braisa of buying wine from the Kutim right before Shabbos, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda says that you may not make such a verbal declaration is because Gezerah Shema Yibaka Hanoid, and as we just spoke out, Shema Yibaka Hanoid is something even less likely, because there is something we can prevent it from happening over Shabbos. So how do you reconcile that? So Gemara explains that really, Talmud Rabbi Yehuda lav mishum dechayish l'mikiyas hanoid. The real reason why Rabbi Yehuda, and that goes to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, they argue with Rav Meir, why Ela Mishum Delays Lei Bereida. They do not subscribe to this whole principle of retroactive clarification. In other words, there's 2 steps here, very important to clarify. when a person who bought this untithed wine, and he makes a declaration that eventually 2 loig will be truma, and the 9 loig is going to be meiser rishon, and the 8 loig is going to be meiser sheni. That declaration, if you will never end up fulfilling your stipulation, that happens if, for example, the wineskin breaks. If you never fulfill your stipulation, so the entire verbal declaration becomes meaningless, and what is right now in the wineskin is tevel. Now, if you will fulfill your stipulation after Shabbos, you'll fulfill it because you can guard the wineskin and it did not break. No one is going to say that your verbal declaration is meaningless. It's meaningful. What is the contents in the barrel is not tevel, but there is some truma and some chulin. And when you will drink wine over Shabbos, maybe you will drink the truma part. Just to make that clear. If you subscribe to Bereira, to retroactive clarification, then we say that after you separate the truma and the meiser, that retroactively clarified that which you separated was the truma and everything else is chulin, which means that lemafreya, what you consumed over Shabbos, was bona fide chulin. If you don't subscribe to Bereira, it's not that we're saying that the declaration has no value. It has a lot of value. Prior to declaration, everything was tevel. Your declaration, taka, separated trumas. Now, in the barrel, there are some truma, some chulin. But when you are drinking out of this barrel on Shabbos, who told you that you're drinking from the chulin? You are drinking from the truma. Gavaldik. Says the Gemara, hold on. Is this not the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? When the Braisa records Rabbi Yehuda saying so to Rav Meir, the Tani Sefer of that Braisa, that Amru was in plural, because I know we're just focusing at Rabbi Yehuda, but really it's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, that all of them told Rav Meir, how can you allow such a solution? Maybe the noid is going to burst. And again, if the noid bursts, it's not only, forget about Bereira, if you will never end up fulfilling your stipulation of at some point separating physically, removing the truma, then the verbal declaration is meaningless altogether. Then everything there is tevel. And Avmeir responded to the 3 Tanoim, listen, if such a thing were to happen, you're right. But we don't have to take that into account. The Amar Lord Avmeir tells them, if that will happen, you're right, but I'm not concerned that it's going to happen. So all this is part of the kash. So Machlal, don't we see from that back and forth that Rabbi Yehuda is chayish lebekiyas hanoid, and it's not about Bereira? So answers the Gemara, no. I will tell you that the reason why Rabbi Yehuda argues with Rav Meir is because Rav Meir does not subscribe to Bereira. And even though your verbal declaration is okay, and even if you'll end up separating the Trumas Umaisres, doesn't matter. What you consumed over Shabbos could have been part Truma. It could have been part Meiser Rishon. Doesn't belong to you. And by Truma, it's much worse. Hassan Rabbi Yehuda hu de Ka'amel Rav Meir. This is what he's really telling him. Lididi leisli Bereira. So the sole concept of doing an action later and that retroactively clarifying, I b'chlal don't subscribe to that. But according to you, Rabbi Meir, you do subscribe to Bereira. But and for that, okay. So now again, we not only resolved the stira, the problem with Abaya, but now also we reconciled the shitos of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Bottom line is, we're still standing with one of the opinions. There was Abzeda that we're not focusing on, but Abaya, who explains that Shitas Rabbi Meir regarding using a living animal, doifel Sukah, that Rabbi Meir says it's invalid because Rabbi Meir holds Shemot Tamus, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't have such a suspicion, which is why he says that it's kosher. Rabbi Yehuda limisa. How did we begin the first Mishnah of Yuma? Aside of everyone's opinion that you have to have a backup Kohen Gadol, just in case the current Kohen Gadol will become invalid, when he will become unqualified, when he will become tamei or other invalidations, and everyone agrees to that. But on that, says Rebbe Yehuda, aside of having a backup Kohen Gadol, you have to have a backup wife with all of the details, when he marries her, what happens with the first wife. You can only have one bias. It was a very beautiful Gemara there. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Af isha cheres maskinaloi, shema tamos ishtoi. Doesn't that directly contradict our Rabbi Yehuda, the way Abai explains it, that holds that there's no cheshasha of shema tamos. Here, dafka, he's chayish that the wife will pass away. So for that, the Gemara says you're right, but don't put all of the halachas of Torah here on the same track. Generally, Rabbi Yehuda is not chayish lemisa. Everything fits. Rabbi Meir is the one that's chayish lemauta. That's why everything fits. He's chayish lemisa. What's in Yuma? We learned that Rabbi Yeshua mal osu bekapara. A higher standard was made regarding kapara, which is exactly what Yom Kippur is all about. So even though Rabbi Yehuda generally is not chayish, here he is chayish. It's a very small possibility. We don't have to, in other areas of halacha, take it into account, but to make sure that if such a thing were to happen, we're not stuck, and therefore we would lose some level of kapara on Yom Kippur. So we got to adhere to a higher standard. All right. Now says the Gemara, Bein lamanda amar shema tammuz. Say, according to the explanation of Abaye, Bein lamanda amar shema tivrach. Let's not forget Rab Zera gave his other explanation of this machlokes, but the commonality between Abaye and Rab Zera's interpretation of the machlokes is that even Rabbi Meir, who passes, he only passes it midrabanan. It's gzeira. In other words, midoiraisa mechitza ma'aliyahi. It's really a good mechitza. It's only the Rabbanon that make a decree. Let's not forget that on Daf Chav Gimel, even though the Braisa began discussing using an animal as a partition for a sukkah, the Braisa then added other halachas. The Braisa added regarding Rav Meir, that you can't use it as a lechi law to a mavoi, that you can't use it for pasib berois, and then you cannot use it for a goyla lekevin. Now that will be a problem. Why would Rav Meir say that if someone had a coffin, let's touch that goyel means a tomb covering as a partition, and there is a halacha midoiraisa that a tomb covering acquires mamish tumas meis, and it can so contaminate all other things that are susceptible to becoming tami betumas meis. If you're telling me that on a biblical level it's considered a partition, so then tetami mishum goyel. And Alama Tanan, it's interesting over here that even though we learned in the Braisa, Rav Meir writing the words that it's not metame mishum goylo, the Gemara is quoting here a Mishnah. We learned in the Mishnah the same thing. We learned in the Mishnah in Eruvin that the Rabbi Yehuda, which by the way holds metame mishum goylo, and Rav Meir metayer. Now we got ourselves a problem. Why would Rav Meir be metayer? The Chachamim, again, they can be machmer. They can put a fence around the Torah. They can't take away a Tumah Midoiraisa. How are they doing that? This is Gavaldik. So, and because of that, the Gemara doesn't answer this. In other words, we basically now are refuting both Abaye and Rab Zera. You can't explain the Baraisa on Daf Chav Gimel that the problem that Rav Meir has with using a living animal as a partition is only a rabbinic issue. It must be a biblical issue. And only that will explain why, therefore, it's also used lekula, that if you used an animal as a goylo lekever, that it won't give off the tumas goylo. And indeed, Elo Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Kasava Rabbi Meir. Now listen to this gavaldik logic. Kol mechitza shoy medes beruach, any partition that is only standing erect because of breath, and here in our case is because the animal is breathing. So what is really creating the mechitza? Now I know that the breath in the animal, right, is in the animal. The animal is, flesh and meat and bones, but it's breath that's keeping the animal erect. Breath is a non-tangible. Breath is a non-tangible. So therefore, you can't use an animal as a mechitza because you don't really have yourself a mechitza. And that invalidation is a biblical invalidation. Kol mechitza sho'imedes beruach, simply because it's only standing because of ruach, al yidei ruach, is not called a mechitza. Another way of wording the same concept, but it's different. Ikada Amri, that Omar Rabbi Yaakov, Kosova Rabbi Meir holds that Kol Mechitza She'ena Asuya Bidei Adam Ena Mechitza. Oh, another nuance, that the fact that the partition, the fact that the life force in the animal is not man-made. It's not about breath being untangible, but it's about, is it man-made? It's not man-made. And by the way, it sounds almost like Shema Tammuz, but it's much more than that. Since you were not the one that put the soul into the animal, it's not within your ability to do so, so therefore it's not called a mechitza. What's the difference whether you emphasize on the fact that the breath is not tangible, or whether you emphasize that a life force that's not man-made cannot be used for a mechitza? Huge. Today you have balloons, and then they would blow air into a wineskin or other types of kalim. What happens if we blew into a certain shell and it inflated? Can you use that for a mechitza? According to the first version of Rabbi Yaakov, no, you can't. Because if that which is making, let's say, the balloon stand erect is breath, I don't care that you were the one that did it. Breath is a non-tangible. If the issue is dafka concerning the life of an animal because the life force is not man-made, then in the case where you blew up something, that will be considered a valid partition. As the Gemara says, that might be nayu, the second to last line on the Amid, that if you created the wall by blowing up a wineskin, that's oimedes beruach, is eino mechitza, as we explained, because since breath is intangible, you can't count it as a mechitza, even though it's holding up something that is tangible. So then, hare oimedes beruach, I don't care that you were the one that blew up the balloon, still it's oimedes beruach, so it's invalid. But Lamad, according to the second version, that the explanation that Rav Acha gave him, Rav Meir, why biblically a animal is not good, because it's eina asuya b'dei adam, because life force is not man-made. Oh, so that's only concerning a living being. Hare, this noid or any other today, a balloon, is asuya b'dei adam, and yes, man was the one that introduced the air into it. Man-made is okay. Ruach is intangible. I don't care, because the ruach is not in the air. The ruach is inside something. A Gavaldika, two versions, B'shitas Rav Acha. Okay, and with that, we concluded the explanation of the Braisa and Chav Gimel Amud Aleph that spoke about using a living animal as a wall. And now we're going to go to the end of that Braisa, that the final thing the Braisa said is Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that you also cannot use a living animal to write on it a document of a get, a divorce document. And the question will be, why is that? Omar, the master of the Braisa, taught us above that Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili Yomru, that ein koisvin olav gitei nashim. Says the Gemara, my time that Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Why would that be? We're going to go now to Gitin. The Tanya we learned in Abraisa. We're focusing on a pasuk that we have on Parshas Kiseise that writes v'chosav lo sefer krisus v'nasan biyada. Says the Abraisa that the word sefer implies that the surface upon which you're writing the get is a sefer. How do you teach a sefer? The narrow definition of a sefer is a parchment. Today you would say a paper, but that's it. So ainly ela sefer. It has to be a parchment document. It doesn't exclude paper. They just did that to write on that which you would write books out of. And not what? And from that word, you would say that you cannot write a get on a wooden tablet. And the other machlokes that we're not addressing directly, can you write it on food? Rashi brings both of these because that's really the sugi over there. And sefer l'chu'ura would exclude both. It has to be on a sefer, meaning on a document, on a paper or on a parchment. However, minayin l'rabbeis kol davar, this Tana ascribes that you are allowed to write a get on a wooden tablet. You are allowed to write it, like Rashi says, on a leaf of an olive tree. or other food items. Oh, so Talmud Loimer says the Tana, since it says v'kosav law, and the Torah could have written, guys, listen, the Torah could have written that the Nasan biyoda sefer krisus, would have been clear that he should place in her hand a document of separation. The words v'kosav law are mamish extra. So says the Tana that sefer is it's a limit. You can only write it on a sefer. But to add to that, you take the kosav law and it tells you that mikol makom, you can write it on anything. Well, if you can write it on anything, imkei ma Talmud loimer sefer. Sefer does mean, let's say, a parchment document. Today you would say a paper document, because we still do exclude. What do we exclude? Loimer loch ma sefer davar she'ein bei ruach hayim. Sefer is something that's not alive. And according to this Tana, ve'ein oichel, again, that's not going to be the focus. So af kol davar she'ein bei ruach hayim ve'ein oichel. So therefore, you would be allowed to write it on a wooden board, and you would be allowed to write it on a leaf of an olive tree that's not oichel. But you cannot write it not on a living thing and not on oichel. And that is the source of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Now the Rabbanan of that Beraisa, they validate you writing a get both on food and on a living animal. Problem is, again, it was a great limit. We had the word sefer, and then we had the word v'chasav law that expounds upon it, that expands it. So v'rabanan I kasav ba sefer, as Rashi says 4 lines from the top. If the Torah would have written v'kasav law krisus ba sefer, then the word ba sefer would have meant on a parchment document. And then you have the right to say that the words v'kasav law to begin with is extra. So it adds to not only on a parchment document, but on kol davar. But now that it says sefer, not ba sefer, but sefer, to begin with, sefer is not speaking about on what you write it, but sefer is describing what needs to be written. And this is what we quote in the Bar Mitzvah Maimer. This is mamish the opening of Sefer Yetzirah regarding the word Sfiras. What does Sefer mean? So Sefer also means Sipur. In other words, L'Sfiras Devarim Ba'alma, that what the Torah is telling you, that what affects the severance, the narration, there has to be words that share the story, the narrative that this man is being koides his wife. So if Basefer is not Bechlal referring to upon which your whole base goes away. Oh, it's maybe again, there's Basefer. So that already begins. You have to write it on parchment, and then you have a V'chasav law, you built upon it. No, the whole Basefer is not speaking upon which, it's telling you what needs to be done, that the way a man divorces his wife is by recording a narrative of severance. Now, V'rabanan, because of my dar shubah. Okay, very good. But don't forget that we pointed out very well, the Torah could have written the Nasan biyada sefer krisus, and types very good. Sefer krisus means again a narration of severance. The words v'kasav law are extra. Says the Gemara, only boyalei another thing, and that is that only b'chsiva mizgareshes ve'ena mizgareshes b'kasev. That what will affect a divorce only a written document and not giving her money. Why would you think that giving a woman money, one's wife, that should affect the get? Makes a lot of sense. Because as we will learn so many dinim, that the Torah writes v'yatsa v'hoisa, that she leaves, and then she will become someone else's wife in the parsha of Kiseitze. And from that Chazal, because of that juxtaposition, they learn many dinim in which we do compare the marriage to the divorce. And we begin Kiddushin by learning by Kesef Minolan. That one of the 3 ways that we affect Kiddushin is the first one the Mishnah mentions is by Kesef. So one would have thought, Ma Havaya, just like to affect the becoming, the marriage, is Bekesef, maybe it's here Bekesef. So the Torah needs to write the words V'kasav law to exclude any other medium. It has to be something that's written. Now, but how does he know that a get is only effective if you are writing a document? Don't forget, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the words v'kasav law is not coming to teach you that it's only through writing and not by something else. The word v'kasavla is to add to the items upon which, if, let's say, you will choose to write it, it doesn't only have to be Basefer. So answers the Gemara, me Sefer Krisus. The word Krisus, it's a document of severance. In other words, we're learning like there's like a hekesh, Sefer Krisus. So we say that the Krisus only happens through the Sefer. It's from the juxtaposition of these two words together. Sefer Korsa ve'ein davar acher kors. Now ve'idach, they don't need to learn from this juxtaposition, this din of Sefer Korsa ve'ein davar acher korsa, because they learn it from the v'kasavla. So what do they learn from this hekesh? Ahomi boyle that ledavar akoyres beinoi lebeino. That when a man is writing a get to his wife, it has to be something that creates a complete, absolute severance. And not what? Not that the man should have the ability of writing some sort of stipulation in the get that will always keep her bound to that stipulation, indirectly always keeping her bound to him. And Kidatanya, we learned in Abraisa, and guys, Bachlal, nowadays, if there is a divorce, no stipulations are ever added to it. Like nowadays, when a man affects Kedushin, no stipulation are used, but according to halacha, you could make a Tanai in the Kedushin and you can make a Tanai in the Gittin. But there are limits to the Tanai and the Get. And here goes the Brais. If a man tells his ex-wife to be on the condition that you will never drink wine, which means that for the rest of her life, she's bound by that stipulation, that means that the Sefer was not koides completely. Or you may never visit your father, or any other stipulation that will keep her bound forever. That ein zeh krisus. However, kol shloishim yom, if a man makes these two conditions or any other condition, but he says it's only for 30 days, then harei zeh krisus, by the way, it's koides immediately. And that is learned, according to the Chachamim, from the juxtaposition of Sefer Krisus. Now, Ve'idach, meaning Rabbi Yossi Haglili, how does he learn this din? So it says the Gemara, Mikores Krisus Nafka, the Torah could have written Sefer Kores, and from the Sefer Krisus, he has now room to learn the two dinim. And Ve'idach and the Chachamim, Kores Krisus loy darshe. Okay, Atka. Moving on to the next din in Sukah. Says the Mishnah. Unlike the issue of building a sukkah on top of a tree. And as we learned, midrabanan, you may not climb on a tree. You may not be mishtamish be'ilan. And the whole issue of whether the sukkah is good for chalamoyed, we learned Rashi in the Mishnah. If you go on it and you violated the drabanan, will you be yoytze the mitzvah doiraisa and all of that? Now we're learning a whole new case. You are using the trunk of a tree to serve as a wall to the sukkah. The hoyelon is the fanisla. So here says the Mishnah, you have absolutely no problem. All right, kshedo. And guys, if you remember, we learned in all of those interesting scenarios in the Mishnah that if you build the sukkah in a way where it's leaning against the trees, right? And if you were to remove the trees, the schach were to collapse, that's a much bigger problem. Here again, Rashi emphasizes, you don't need, the trees are only serving as walls and not as a support to the schach. So the Mishnah writes that it's kosher. Now, Omar Avacha by Yaakov, and we're going to come back to our Mishnah, he gave the following rule, that kol mechitza she'eni yochaylu la'amid beruach matsuya, if you have a partition that is unable to stand up against even a usual wind, says Rav Acha eino mechitza. It's not halachically called a partition, meaning not only if a usual wind will make the wall fall down, even if it's going to stand, but it's going to sway to and fro, and swaying to and fro, technically, let's go in halacha, that if it's going to move a tefach to both sides, a tefach here and a tefach back, it's b'chadchila not called a mechitza. And now the problem is, how can Abacha make such a statement? L'cha'ura, if you're using trees as the walls of a sukkah, are we not also speaking about saplings, smaller trees, or using the sometimes the branches of trees that will sway to and fro through the wind? Doesn't it say in our Mishnah, asks the Gemara, Tanan ha'isa sukasi beno ilanois, and v'ilon is the fanisla, the Mishnah says ksheda. And Allah, how can you, but why? V'haka azal v'asi. it will, trees will sway with the wind. So Rav Acha will limit the case of the Mishnah. Now, obviously, guys, if you have these huge trees and the part that you are using for the wall is the solid trunk, then what we're saying now is not needed. But what Rav Acha is adding, forget about caution. Exactly that we're speaking about. The trees are large, and the hard trunk is that which is being used for the walls, and it does not move back and forth. But what about if you are using the branches, and the branches will swing back and forth? So even if you use the branches, the Ovid Lebo Hutzavadafno, that you will weave the branches together with palm branches and the like. And when you do that, you fortified, you so to say, fixed the branches that it should be sturdier. Again, the technical is you don't want it to go in either direction, a tefach or more. Says the Gemara, no, there's a chiddush. Mao the tema that nigzoid dilma osilish tamusha be'ilan. The issue is that true. You don't need these trees as a support for your schach. You're certainly not building it on top of a tree. But if you're going to have as a wall, you're going to have a tree. You might end up leaning on a tree on Shabbos is asan midrabanan. Any type of direct usage of a tree is asan midrabanan. Even tzideim, right? The heter is only tzideim. So maybe the Chazal would have made a takana that you can't use it as walls for Yom Tiv. So Kamash Malan that we make no such gezeirom. Says the Gemara, Tashema, get another attempted question, refutation against Rav Acha bar Yaakov. It says in a Braisa, Hoya Shamilan, they were speaking about, again, the Pasei Birois, the wells that were built on the way going from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, affording the Yidden that are doing the mitzvah of Aliyah Lidegel, for them being able simply to pull over to the side of the road and spending Shabbos there and having all of the water that they need for their animals and themselves. And the issue of how can you take water out of a well if the well is 4x4 and it goes down 10 tfachim, it's a bottom five. The areas around it is minimally is considered a carmelis, and the solution that they gave is the most lenient type of mechitzas ever. And that is, you have these right angle boards that only go out in either side one amma. They're called pasei bira'os, the oimdim, double. So you have 4, which is really 8. And you are allowed, as long as the area in between the open area, I think again is 16.6. That's what I remember, Amos. In other words, there's a substantial amount of space that you can have in between them. And everything in there is considered a reshus hayachid. And furthermore, says the Braisa, you don't have to put yourself these pasei bira'os. If there is already a natural mechitza, it could be incorporated and used as part of the pasei bira'os. So, for example, if you have a tree, or if you already have a pre-built fence, or if you have a mechitza of kanim, a wall of reeds, so nidai mishum diyoimid, you can use it as a diyam with all of the details, right? It has to go an amma, but use that which is already there. And the question is, one of the things that the Braisa allows to be used is a tree, because it's considered a partition. If you, Rav Acha bar Yaakov, are telling me that any mechitza that is unable to stand erect without swaying to and fro by a regular wind is b'chlal not called a mechitza, how can such a elon be used? So there also the Gemara says, either we're speaking about a tree, I mean, the Gemara doesn't have to say it, because the Braisa doesn't limit you to only being allowed to use the cushion, like in our Mishnah. It's a categorical statement. It must mean the trunk, it must mean the leaves, it must mean the branches. Yeah, even by the branches, as long as the Ovid Lebo Hutzavadafno. And now the Gemara is going to have a real strong question on this, because this way out of making Hutzavadafno, Lucha'ura won't work for the following Braisa. Toshema, it says in another Braisa, now there we're speaking about, again, Shabbos carrying, you are out there in the field, and there is this huge tree whose leaves and branches really surround the tree and they droop down. So says the Braisa that Ilan ha-mesech ala aretz, there's a natural canopy. In other words, it's coming all the way down. Now we know the din of lavud. It doesn't have to touch the ground, but it has to come within 3 tefachim from the ground. Im ein noifer geveim aretz. If the edges of these branches are not above the ground, 3 tefachim, it's within 3 tefachim. So now you have yourself a proper partition. So we are allowed to view the area under the tree as a sectioned off Rishus HaYachid, Mitaltal and Tachtov. And here again we have a kasha. Why? To make it a Rishus HaYachid, you have to have a midrabanan l'kul ha'alma 4 mechitzas. If you're telling me that anything that is swaying back and forth, here we're not using the trunk, here we're using the branches. So if you're using those branches, aren't they moving with the wind? So here, but we already know the answer. Yeah, and indeed, the Braisa must mean I am I ha'ka'azi v'asel. So are you going to tell me, Hasam Nami, the Ovid Label Hutzav Dafna? Yeah, the Mishnah Baraisa only means you can use it if prior to Shabbos you wove into the edges and to the ends of these branches palm leaves or other materials that secure this canopy, this natural canopy, to its place, that it should not blow, it should not sway to and fro. Here it's a lot more problematic. And why is it here a lot more problematic? Second to last line, this is my kasha. We should be allowed to carry under this canopy no matter how large the canopy is. And who said otherwise? Allama Amar Afuna Bereid Rabbi Yeshua, a metaltal and boy, Daf Chafei, Ela Beis Sosayim, Chevre, let's chazer something we have in Shabbos and in Eruvin, and that is that if you have yourself a proper Rishus HaYachid, if you have for yourself an area that is enclosed for people to live in, Shehu Kaf Ladira, there is no limit to how large the inner Rishus HaYachid is, you are fully allowed to carry in there. But there is a rule that if you have an area that's not made, it's not hukaf ledira, it wasn't sectioned off for you to live in it, midrabanan, if it's beis sosayim, which is, if you remember, 5,000 square amas, midrabanan, it goes back to having the din of a karmelis, and Rav Huna, Bereid Rabbi Yeshua, linked this din to the case of the natural canopy. Now, this must be this humongous tree, which fine. Now, hold on. If nothing was done, there was no human intervention, no weaving was done to affix the branches, that I got. So you can say that the area under the canopy was loy hukaf ledira. But if you're going to have to limit the case of the Braisa, as we did up until now, for sure, you can only use it if you affixed it, if you made it stronger. It should not sway with the wind. If you were the one that invested koyach to, so to say, weave the edges of the branches together, affixing them a lot better, so then you made your effort. And what's your goal? You were traveling, you want to spend Shabbos underneath the canopy, and you don't want to be bound with the laws of carrying. Well, if you did it to live underneath it, then why should there be any such limitation? And answers the Gemara that if you remember the dinim of hukaf ladira or loy hukaf ladira, karpaf shaloy hukaf ladira, there is another din, and that is that even if you built a partition for people to be in it, but it's primarily for people to have that place, for them to be better shoymrim for the areas outside of it, and that's called dira shetashmisheha la'avir, a dwelling whose primary usage is for the open air that's outside of it. And what the Gemara is really saying is that if you're traveling out of Shabbos and you find this beautiful large tree, and if you were the one that with the Hutza and Dafna, you affixed the mechitzas that it should not sway to and fro in order for you to spend Shabbos underneath it, for that Rav Huna Bereid Rabbi Yeshua made no such limitation. What was he speaking about? That you came to this natural tree and this natural canopy where prior to you arriving here, the branches that were creating the canopy were already affixed. Now, why would a person b'chlal affix such a canopy? So, because when you have fields and you need to have people that stand guard for what? For the produce in the fields. Animals or people should not come, take and steal it, etc. In other words, then a shomer cannot stand open under the sun the whole day. So you want him to have a protected area, but he's not there to live in it. He's there to guard that which is outside of it. And here we also have this rabbinic limitation that if you have a dira whose primary function is la'aviris for the open space area outside of it, and only there did Rav Huna Bereid Rabbi Yeshua put the limitation. So it's already a little bit more of a doichik. In other words, what we are saying is that you can spend Shabbos underneath it only if the branches were fixed, and if effort was not made, then the ruach mitsuya, it's going to sway back and forward. And on the other hand, it was not made it was not made for you to be shoivas there. If it was made for you to be shoivas there, there's no such limitation. It was made prior. If it was made prior, then you have to presume it was made for it to be used as some sort of guardian hut. And that's why, yes, we put the limitation, the rabbinic limitation, that you can only carry that if it's larger than Beis Osayim or Beis Osayim and larger, then you no longer can carry underneath it. And let's
based on that, Rabbi, if you had a hut out in the field, nothing to do with the tree, that a man-made nice hut, it can't be bigger than Beis Osayim because it's there to service the field. That's what we're learning now.
That's correct. That's good. But guys, don't forget, Beis Osayim is 5,000 square amos. That's a very large hut. This scenario is very rare.
Yeah, and that would be a very large tree. I don't think it exists.
That would be a very good, very large tree. But we have to address it because Rabbi Yeshua addressed that. Okay, let's find one. Tashema. Again, this is an attempted refutation against Rabbi Achar Bar Yaakov. It says in a Braisa, here again, Shabbos B'Teil, you're traveling and you're going to spend Shabbos out there. And normally the halacha will be that you can't carry. What happens if there is a mound? And then, we learned the details. It has to be on an incline that over 4 amas. It goes up 10 tfachim. We consider the walls, so to say, around the mound to be bona fide mechitzas. And indeed, now, how large is the area on top of the mound? If the area is less than 4 amas, then it's irrelevant. Once it's a very small mound, you can carry on that, not because you are in a reshus hayachid, because b'toich dalad amas, you don't have an issue. So it's dalad amas, again, up until Beis Osayim, again, more than Beis Osayim, even though it's surrounded by this natural mechitza, it's called a karpav, and midrabanan, you're no longer allowed to carry. But if it's within that limitation, and similarly, if instead of it being a mound, if it goes into the ground, if you have a cleft in the ground, again, it has to have halachic partitions, meaning that the walls going down are 10 tfachim, and again, it's from Arba Amas until Beis Osayim. And here comes the final case, come on, ketsura. So a person has this beautiful grain field, and someone began to reap, to harvest the field. And you have until now, you have these circles in the fields made by the aliens. Who knows? You have these circles. So in there, if you're inside such a circle, so you're in a cleared area, but around you, you're surrounded by the standing stalks. And they're 10 tfachim or higher. Vishiboilis makif anoisa. So we view that area as a reshus hayachid. And therefore, not only are you allowed to carry within it, but here we're focusing on the tchum that you can only walk. Forget about carrying. You can only walk outside the place of your residence 2,000 amma, up until 2,000 amma. Question is, what's considered the place of your residence? So if you take out Shabbos in the open field, you only are given dalad amas. And you have to start counting the 2,000 amma from right out. You really have 2,004 amas, if you remember. But since this is considered a natural, so to say, the reshus hayachid, so you get to only start measuring the 2,000 amas outside of this area. So mahalach eskula v'chutzal al payim amma. Here again, why are you allowed to view the area inside as a reshus hayachid? Because you are relying on the mechitzas. Now, when you have a mound or you have a cleft, the wind doesn't move the earth. It's not swaying back and forth. But the third case that the Braisa gave was just a beautiful, you're in middle of a field, that you are in the area that was already harvested, and then right around you, you're surrounded by standing stalks. But don't they move with the wind? And here again, we have to say that the Ovid label that has to be fixed in a way. Just practically, if you weave the innermost standing stalks with hutzah and daphne or any other type of natural materials, which is just an example of what people would have used. You can use ropes, doesn't matter what you use. The vart is that we are standing with the din of Rav Achar Bar Yaakov, that if you have a partition that is swaying to and fro, it's not called a partition. And this is the biggest challenge that people have with what we call with the tarp sukkahs. I'm not saying that the tarp cannot be fixed. The tarp could be fixed. But if you notice that many people are not going to rely on their fixing of the tarp because of this din of Rav Achar Bar Yaakov, And what will they do? They'll use a solution, as we keep on learning, the solution of lavud. They build another mechitza, and they're not going to be using a lattice, even if the strings or the ropes are going to be going only in one direction. I think the most common thing that I saw is that people put the skinniest of string, but that does not move with the wind, right under 3 tfachim from the ground. Then they put another string, which is less than 3 tfachim above the first one. In other words, they go up until 10 tfachim. As long as each rope, each string, or any other material, adarabah, you can use a little skinny board, is within 3 tfachim, one with the other. So we use the din of lavud, and you created for yourself proper mechitzas that are not swaying with the wind. That is something that many people witnessed, to go and to make sure that you're not relying on a wall that is swaying to and fro. On the other hand, to make it clear, no one is being moitzi laz. You have so many fruma yidden that use the tarp sukkahs, but all of them make an effort that it should be fixed. And again, if it blows a little bit, it's not the end of the world. We're looking that it should not go a tefach in either direction, God willing, to be continued. Guys, give me just a moment over here. Let's make a refill. All right.
Rabbi,
Yes.
let me ask you a question regarding this whole wineskin and the Brera and the Rabbi Yisrael of Yehuda situation, yeah? So I was thinking a very simple answer as to why you would be worried, let's say, about a wineskin, but not about the sukkah, is because by the wineskin, even if it's uncommon, if it breaks, you really have no resolution. You consume tevel, chayiv koros, right? If you have an animal that's the wall of your sukkah, and let's just say it falls down or it runs away, okay. So now you don't have a kosher sukkah. All right, fine. So now you have to go to use your neighbor's sukkah or build another sukkah or whatever.
Correct.
But the actual outcome is not such a big deal. It's just now you don't have a structure that you can use as a sukkah.
So I hope I spoke out to Rashi. So Rashi writes like this, Danny, that don't forget, even if the animal dies, the animal doesn't disappear. What we are afraid is that the animal isn't an elephant, but it's not a little cat. So when the animal is going to die, the carcass will be there. What people won't chop is that when you have something that's borderline kosher, because it's 10 tvachim, it's 11 tvachim, it's 12 tvachim, whatever it is, and something will happen that the average person won't chop. Oh my God, the mechitza is not the right height. If the death of the animal would mean the animal will disappear, then what you're saying is 1,000% correct. Who cares if the animal dies? If it dies, it dies.
Is that it would run away, right? That's whatever. And Shema Thomas, either way you look at it.
No, Shema Tivrach, your question is on Shema Tivrach, but we're dafka focusing on Shema Thomas. Shema Tivrach is less problematic. So let the animal run away.
Right. I'm just saying that the whole idea that you have to, the question of the question of Rameir on Rameir, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda, to me, I don't know why you have to come to an answer to say, he doesn't hold of Breira. Maybe he does hold of Breira. I'm just saying that conceptually, idea of a wineskin breaking is much more problematic
than having this collapse. Correct.
Right.
Okay. All right. Chavra, we're learning now a shas sugi over here. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah daf chafei. Chavra, this is a very important daf. We are addressing the huge topic known as ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah. And the Mishnah is going to open up speaking about shluchei mitzvah paturim min hasukah, and we're learning our sugya the way most Rishonim learn it, and that's linking that the reason why if you have a shliach that's on a mitzvah mission, during the mission, that person is exempt from dwelling in the sukkah, it's based on the principle that ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah. Now, it's self-understood that you have to define better this concept that someone who's occupied in a mitzvah is exempt from other mitzvahs, because, just as an example, that we, thank God, we are talis katan. I'm doing a mitzvah. Are you going to tell that a yid who's wearing a talis katan is, God forbid, exempt from doing other mitzvahs? He's oisik b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah. So there's a lot to speak about from many different angles. We're going to learn a shtickle toisviz that says clearly that the word ha'oisik is not hamakayim. Ha'oisik means when you're occupied in a mitzvah in a way that right now, if you were to do another mitzvah, you would have to stop doing the current one. And that's the pshat, that ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah. It sounds simple, but it's not that simple. As we will unpackage the sugya, we're going to learn the sources for this rule. We're going to see that the way we define ha'oisik b'mitzvah isn't only if someone is preoccupied with a mitzvah, begashmius, doing physically, but it's even if there is a mental preoccupation. Even there, we say that if this person would be obligated to do another mitzvah, they would have to somehow retake back their mental preoccupation. They're not obligated to do that. And that's going to lead us into a sugya regarding avelus, that we're going to learn on today's daf, that an avel who's in mourning, who's preoccupied with sadness, he is obligated in keeping all the mitzvahs, with the exception of tefillin. Halacha l'maisa, how this works out today, we say that by the oinen, and there's even scenarios where if a person already finished preparing all that's needed to bury, and for whatever reason, the burial did not yet happen. So we have some people that we know that have a total bitsina, they should be wearing their tefillin. This is a sugya that we will learn in much greater detail, Masechtas Moed Katan, but we will learn a Gavaldik Gemara Rashi, who writes here on Sukah Chafei that a person is not chayiv. There's no mitzvah to have tsar when a person lost a relative. It's a natural thing, but there's no mitzvah in the tsar. There is mitzvah in doing the things an aval is mechoyev to do. But as we will see, that the preoccupation of tsar by avelus is a non-mitzvah. And when do we say that if a person is preoccupied, even only mentally, in a mitzvah, are they exempt from a mitzvah? If it's exactly that, if they are preoccupied in a mitzvah. But other tirdos, other mental preoccupations, which make it difficult to do a mitzvah, so we have to there, yes, make the effort and do the mitzvah. Now, what we will learn again, Gemara Rashi, hopefully we'll get there, on Daf Chafei Amid Beis, is we're going to learn about Hassan and Shushvinin v'chol b'nei hachupa. We're going to learn about halachas regarding the Hassan himself. Shushvinin in our context doesn't mean the two unterfrieders. Shushvinin means the groom's close friends. B'nei hachupa, this Chazal, chupa doesn't mean what you think about a chupa. When people got married in the times of Chazal, they would have a location. You can even call it a home where the Hassan and Kala lived for 7 days. And there is where all of the Sheva Brachas were celebrated. So the Hassan and Kala stayed put, and it was a 7-day celebration. And whoever is involved in that celebration are people that are involved in a mitzvah. And we're going to see whether they are exempt or whether they are not exempt of certain mitzvahs. And as Rashi will teach the Gemara in Daf Chafei Amud Beis, that really this whole principle of ha'oisek b'mitzvah, pater min mitzvah, is subject to a machlokes tanoim, at least according to Rashi. Chavra, let's start the Mishnah. Daf Chafei the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, shluchei mitzvah. Those who are on a mitzvah mission, peturin min Sukah, they are exempt from Sukah. Let's read inside the Rashi. Shluchei mitzvah. Hoilchei baderech mitzvah. For example, a person is going to learn Torah. A person is going lahagbel penei rabbi. A person is going on a trip to be poidin shvuyin. Says Rashi, peturim min Sukah. Listen to the words of Rashi. Va'afilu b'shas chaniyasan. Not only when they are actually physically traveling, but even if they're going from point A to point B, they're overnighting in a location while they are resting, but they are still in middle of their mission. Even then, they are exempt from the Sukah. Now, hold on. Let's go. Keep your finger in the Mishnah. Look inside the second Tosfos. And as we spoke out in the intro, this concept, shluchei mitzvah, hoilchei b'dvar mitzvah, and he quotes what Rashi writes. They are pater from the Sukkah, even b'shas chaniyasan. And I'm going to scoot down a couple of lines. Frek Tosfos v'teima, im yecholim l'kayim shneim amai peturin. The atu adam sheyesh leitzitzes bebigdoi, or if a person is wearing tefillin beroishoi, mi mifter bekach, doesn't make sense. So answers Tosfos again. I'm scooting down another few lines. Ela vadai loy mifter ela b'shah shehu oisig ba. And it gives an example. For example, if a person is now busy returning a lost article, tali shel aveda. And as we will learn, that even prior to you finding the owner, there are certain things you need to do to the article that you found to make sure that it doesn't get ruined till when you return it. And one of the things you have to do is you have to stretch it out. You have to open it up, air it out. And v'shoitcha litzorcha. Or you have an animal that you found prior to returning it, you have to feed it. That if while you are doing that action, then an ani comes and he asks you for $1, then is where we say that ha'oisek b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah. Now, in defense of Rashi, it's not that Rashi understands that you don't have to be oisek b'mitzvah. Rashi doesn't say that if you're wearing talis cotton, wearing a talis gadol, you're exempt from all the mitzvahs. Rashi holds that if a person would think that while they're going on a trip, so while they're traveling, they can eat. But the moment they rest, they got to build themselves a sukkah, b'shas chaniyasan, they lechatchila won't go on the trip. It's going to hinder their trip. So in such a case, you extend the ha'oisek b'mitzvah even during the couple of hours that you're taking a rest from the asaka in the mitzvah. Let's go back in the Mishnah. Din number 2. Guys, din number 2 and din number 3, we're going to leave for the following shiur. Din number 2 in the Mishnah is chulin u'mishamsheyem, u'mishamsheyem p'turim min asukah. That's someone who's ill. And those who are attending to the ill, they are exempt from the sukkah. And din number 3, that oichlin v'shoisen aray chutz l'sukkah. That if you're having what halachically we'll consider the casual meal, a casual drinking session, that is something that is allowed to happen even outside the sukkah. And again, we're going to leave the choylin and the oichlin aray for later, and we're going to focus, the whole daf today is going to be focusing on the shluchei mitzvah, peturim min sukkah. And again, guys, we understand that Shluchei mitzvah paturim and Sukah is not a unique din to Sukkahs. It's leaning on, it's based on, it's founded on the general rule that ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. How do you know that from? And there's so many questions on this Gemara. Like many people ask, it's a logic. In other words, if we're going to follow what we read in Tosfos, and Nachsei Rashi also subscribes to it generally, if you are occupied in a mitzvah right now, why would you think otherwise? Why would you think if you can't do two mitzvahs at the same time and you are already involved in mitzvah A, then why would you do mitzvah B if you're doing a mitzvah A? Now, let's leave that open-ended and we'll come back to it in a moment. So the Tanach Rabbanan, this is the Yesod. Abraisa is quoting a pasuk that we just read in Parshas V'Oschana. We read it a few times every day, minimally twice every day. The first portion of the Shema, in which we are speaking about the mitzvah of learning Torah. And when do we do it? B'shivtecha b'veisecha. When you are sitting in your home. So say Chazal, from here we'll see how. Prat lo oisik b'mitzvah. Now we're speaking about the mitzvah reading the Shema. I'm sorry, not about learning Torah. And as Rashi writes, b'shivtecha b'veisecha prat lo oisik b'Torah she'ena chayiv b'kriya Shema. That while a person is oisik b'mitzvah, they're not obligated to read the Shema. How do you see that? We'll leave it for the Gemara. Furthermore, here also we learn the same concept, but we extend it. Not only if you are physically occupied in the Mishnah, but even if there's a mental preoccupation. And the example that we will use is a Hassan, and we're speaking specifically about a Hassan who's marrying a psula. And he is preoccupied in the consummation of his marriage, and there's a mitzvah. So the mental preoccupation puts him in the category of ha'oisik b'mitzvah, and he's now exempt from reading the Shema. And just to give everyone a heads up, that what we will learn today, God willing, in this shiur and Daf Chafei Amud Beis, according to Rashi, that there can be other Tanoim, and according to Rashi, there are other Tanoim that do not subscribe to this general rule that ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. Nevertheless, when it comes to those mitzvahs that are chayvos halavavos, that have a kavana need, like Tefilla, you'll be exempt from Tefilla, not because of the rule ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, but because you can't have kavana. Whether you apply this to the Shema, if you remember what we learned in Brachas in the beginning, is that when a person says the Shema without kavana, they also do not fulfill the obligation. But that pasuk has to be repeated. And we learned the Tosfos that says we don't say the same thing by Shemona Esrei, even though theoretically they're all the same. But who says when you'll repeat the Shemona Esrei, you'll have kavanah the second time? Having kavanah by saying the 6 words of Shema is a lot easier. But anyways, over here we are linking the Chassan who's exempt of reading Shema prior to his consummation of the marriage is connected to this general rule that ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, learned from either b'shivtecha b'veisecha on a physical asaka and uvelechtocha v'derech on a mental asaka. And the Brayso concludes, mikan amru, that hakohen says apsula, if a man is going to marry, he's marrying a virgin, then patur. However, vesu almana, but if he's marrying a woman that was already married previously, then he's going to be chayv. The Gemara is going to explain the difference. But before we go into the detail, how do you b'chlal see from the shivtecha b'veisecha that prat lo oisik b'mitzvah? My mashma. So the Gemara says that indeed you learn it. We're going to begin from uvelechtocha v'derech. Amar Afuna, that uvelechtocha v'derech implies ka derech, like your way, which is when you're going baderech. It means you're going on a reshus trip. How do you know that? We'll see in a moment. Ma derech. The uvelechtocha v'derech is referring to a discretionary trip, reshus. So this traveling, which means reshus, isn't only regarding the trip, but let's go back now to the ubeshivtecha b'veisecha. In other words, everything else mentioned in the pasuk, including b'shivtecha b'veisecha, is only referring to a reshus. So when are you chayv to read the Shema? When you're sitting in your home, is when you're sitting in your home in a discretionary fashion. You are not involved, you're not occupied in a mitzvah. Lafuke hai. But if you have a person that did a mitzvah asuk, bachlal, to such a person, there's no mitzvah to read the Shema. Says the Gemara, 1 second. How do you get that from? You want to say that everything in the pasuk is speaking about the same scenario. Nice. But means reshus. How do you know that? What milo yaskin the causal of mitzvah? People don't only travel for discretionary reasons. People travel for mitzvah reasons. And yet, so the Gemara says no, because the b'shiftecha uvelechtecha, you that the extra chaf, lying a chaf, is taka not needed. If the pasuk would have been inclusive, both l'reshus and l'mitzvah, the Torah would have used the words b'sheves, while sitting, or ubeleches, while traveling. Why does the Torah say you're sitting? B'shiftecha. Why does the pasuk say belechtecha? Beleches didach. There is who the mechayevet. That is when you're obligated to read the Shema. Habeleches the mitzvah, then petiras. And again, why do you need to have 2 psukim? Why do you have to have b'shiftecha b'veisecha and uvelechtecha v'derech? Because if there only would have been one, then we would have applied the ha'oisik b'mitzvah pater b'na mitzvah when you are physically occupied in the mitzvah. When the Torah adds this drasha uvelechtecha v'derech, that's where Chazal add not only when you're oisik physically, even if the asok is mental, you're not doing anything physically, but your mind is preoccupied with a mitzvah, then you are also exempt from another mitzvah. In our case, the example is reading Shema. Hold on. You're also preoccupied in the mitzvah prior to consummating the marriage. So the Gemara says, no, it's not, doesn't work that way. Koines says apsula. When a person is going to marry a psula, then there is a preoccupation. And there is a part of the preoccupation is the worry that she might not be a psula. It's not only about that. He's preoccupied. He's concerned. He wants to make sure that he consummates the marriage properly. She's a psula. If a woman was already previously married, so then you don't have such a preoccupation. Koines es almana, you're not preoccupied prior to the act of consummation, and therefore you're not called oisik. Here clearly, like Tosfos said regarding an action mitzvah, like Tosfos says, it's only that there is oisik. Clearly, by the mental, the Brisa says you have to be preoccupied. Frek the Gemara, hold on. If it's the preoccupation that exempts you, so why don't we say there are many other cases of preoccupations, and it's a non-mitzvah preoccupation. For example, God forbid a person hears that a ship is sinking in the sea, the stock market is crashing, and those people get preoccupied. And if you're going to tell me it's not true. It's not true. Preoccupations, especially for the Shema. Again, we'll speak out at the end of Chav Heyam and Beis. According to Rashi, Shemana Esrei, mitzvahs that demand a longer amount of focus is something more. It's something harder to demand of people. Saying the Shema, Kavana, Shema Yisrael. No, now an aval is preoccupied with the suffering. Nevertheless, the rule is that an aval is chayiv with all the mitzvahs that are written in the Torah, other than wearing tefillin. Why tefillin is unique, and why is that? Because since the Torah uses the word pe'er, glory, in regard to tefillin, it's almost disrespectful for a person to don himself in a glorious manner when they lost someone. And more about this on Atarei Anamid Beis. But other than tefillin, you're chayiv in all the mitzvahs. Now, if the tirda will exempt you, an aval is tarut. So the Gemara says, no, it's not just the preoccupation. Over here, hache, we're speaking about someone who's marrying a psula. It's really from when he marries her until he consummates it, then tarid et tirda of a mitzvah. And we mentioned many times the big machlokes rishonim. What exactly is the mitzvah? Is the mitzvah pru'ravu? And being that we are only allowed to fulfill the mitzvah pru'ravu in the context of a marriage, so therefore there's, so to say, as an extension, there's a mitzvah to marry, or like many other rishonim all know, there is a mitzvah for itself to be married and to get married. Either way, it's called a tirda the mitzvah. Over there, now these are very strong words. Over there, write a oval, a side of tefillin, and oval is chayv and all the mitzvahs. There is a preoccupation. The preoccupation is the tsa'ar, let's type tsa'ar suffering, but that's called the reshus. Chaver is very important to Rashi, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Tirda the reshus, frekt Rashi, avul, afal pishu chayiv linagavelus. And he gives the dinim. And we're going to learn a lot about this in Moed Katan, of Ne'ilah. Ne'ilah means removing leather shoes. There's an isur of having a rechitza of tainuk, similar to on Yom Kippur, sicha, anointing oneself. And all of that is laharois kavoid meisoi. In other words, Rashi gives 3 examples of behavioral mitzvahs in the negative. You have to refrain, not don't do this, don't do that. All of that is the way that we show kavod for the mace. Look inside Rashi. Einoi chayiv lehitztayir. Now, einoi chayiv lehitztayir means there's no mitzvah to suffer. Naturally, people are inside. We're not, God forbid, telling people not to feel pain. But the mitzvah is not the tsar. The mitzvah is the behavior that the avol refrains from l'kvoid mesai. And going back to the Tosfos, here we're speaking about you're not doing anything. If you're not doing, then you can do another positive mitzvah. Ha'oisik b'mitzvah doesn't mean that you are involved in a mitzvah. It means that you're occupied in a mitzvah in a way that if you would be obligated to do mitzvah 2, you won't be able to do mitzvah number 1. All the negative mitzvahs, you're not doing anything. Not doing doesn't take up any time. Doesn't take up any, you're just not doing. But if it's an issue of mental preoccupation, if there would have been a mitzvah to feel tsa'ar for the loss of a relative, then we would say that the tsa'ar is a mitzvah. You are preoccupied in the tsa'ar, and then taki, you would have been exempt. If the only way of you doing the other mitzvah is to make the extra effort of forgetting about removing your focus on the mitzvah tsa'ar. But since here it's a reshus, so therefore an avol is taka chayv in all the mitzvahs. Says the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom, the ha'oisik b'mitzvah potter min ha'mitzvah ma'acha nafke. Is it from here? I have another source, and as we will see, we have 2 sources, and we need 2 sources. Mahasam nafke the Tanya and the parsha ba'aloischa. When we learn about the Yidden that were unable halachically to bring the Pesach Rishon, and they came to Moshe Rabbeinu with the Lam and the Gara, and ultimately we were given the mitzvah of Pesach Sheni. So the pasuk writes, says the Braisa, Vayihi anoshim asher hoyu tmeim lenefesh adam v'goymen. There were people that were impure because they were contaminated with corpse tuma. Exactly who were those people? Oisam anoshim mihayu. And here we're going to have a machlokes tanoim. Last line in the Amid. First opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili is noisei aroi noishal Yosef hoyu. And by the way, we mentioned this many times that we have, perhaps you can even say Babli Yerushalmi, this question whether halachically the Mishnahs are the same, but there is a shita in the Yerushalmi that tzaddikim do not impart tumah. And from the many chazals that clearly hold otherwise is right over here. Ein loch tzaddik gadol than Yosef, that's called the tzaddik, and the tzaddik Elyahu. Okay, so that's another whole topic. And we did mention once that there is a Tosfos that quotes the Midrash regarding Elyahu Hanavi helping Yoshua Hagarsi bury the remains of Rabbi Akiva. Don't forget that according to those who hold that Elyahu Hanavi is Pinchas, who's a Kohen, that is the source for the other side. And it was Yoshua Hagarsi that asked Elyahu Hanavi, 1 second, are you not a Kohen? How can you help me bury the remains of Rabbi Akiva? And that is the other source that we find in Chazal. Oh, because Rabbi Akiva is a tzaddik and they don't impart tumah. Bachlal, I'm not even talking about during the burial. That's another topic that we do find in Bavli. In Ashkafta the Rebbe over there in Ksubas, Kov Gimel, Kov Dalid, right, regarding, we had a Tosfos over there regarding can Kohanim participate in a Levaya of the greatest Jew of the generation. There it's regarding the passing of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. If I'm not mistaken, Tosfos speaks about during the passing. Let's go. I don't remember. I think he was speaking about during the passing of the Rabbeinu Tam, that Kohanim were matama themselves. But just to be aware that over here, clearly Yosef Atzadik imparts Tumah. And those were the ones, the people that were Tameim L'Nefesh Adam were the ones that were busy carrying that Aronis Shel Yosef. So hold Rabbi Yossi Aglin. Daf Chafei Amid Beis. Rabbi Akiva Omer, no, that wasn't the case. Who were the ones that were Tamei, Mishol and El Safan? And as Rashi tells us from the Sifri, that when Nadav and Avihu passed away, and they passed away on the first day of Nissan, so who were told to bury them? The cousins of Adam. Look inside the top Rashi. That Hachi Garsinim Beraisa B'Sifri, that Rabbi Akiva Omer, Mishoel Vel Safan Hayu, Shenitmu Ben Nadav Va'Avihu. Back inside the Beraisa. Two shittas. However, comes along a third opinion. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer can be. Neither of them can be correct. Why? Because im noisei aroinoi shel Yosef hayu. When did they have to carry the Aron of Yosef? Only when we were moving in the Midbar. Once we came to a place of rest, to a place of Chanoya, they could have left the Aron shel Yosef very respectfully in a tent and not go in there. Now, guys, let's not forget. Rashi reminds us to say that Hadvarim, that on the first day of Nissan, the first day of Nissan is when we are almost a year, right? A year minus a month, already camped by Har Sinai. When we got to Har Sinai on 2 months, to Rosh Chodesh Sivan, we were there until the next year, the 20th of Iyar. We were there for a year minus 10 days. The day that the Mishkan was inaugurated, we know this, the Shmini Lameloyim was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So the Aron Shel Yosef and those who carried the Aron Shel Yosef had a tremendous amount of time before they were not recontaminating themselves, but I'm not done yet. But how were they going to become pure from that tumah? So we know that one of the things that happened on the day of Rosh Chodesh Nisan is that Hashem gave us the parsha of Paraduma on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And when did we actually, Elazar HaKohen Shech, the first Paraduma, when did we have the ashes to become tired from Tumas Meis on Beis Nisan? It's very important. So, who said that the people that came to Moshe Rabbeinu had ample time to become Tahor? So as we will learn a Chazal, that they told Moshe Rabbeinu that we cannot make Pesach by Yom Ahu. We had the Sugya in Pesachim Daf Tzadik. If you remember, just quickly reminding the soul Sugya, if a person is on the 7th day of Tumas Meis, and they did everything right, they underwent all of the sprinklings on the 3rd day and now on the 7th day, and they will become Tahor at night. They will become tired at night. And guys, we're not speaking about Nechusre Kapara. There are people that even after they become tired, but they can't eat kacham until they bring karbanos on the next day. That's not the case of someone who's tamei b'tumas meis. There is no kapara, there's no karbanos that they have to wait for the next day. So if a Jew on the 7th day, right now is still tamei, but once it's dark, they can eat kacham. So we're going to follow the shita that holds that one would have thought, well, you can bring the Korban Pesach on their behalf. Anyways, no one eats the Korban Pesach on the 14th. You can only eat it after it's dark. And after dark, they are allowed to eat it. We're following those who hold it may not be brought for them. And that is exactly the case of the people who are unable to bring the Pesach Rishon. The Torah says that they were unable to bring the Pesach by Yom Ahu. Now, let's think about this. If the people that were Tamei were the ones who carried the Aron Shel Yosef from Beis Nisan, you have more that Yud Daled is not the 7th day from Beis Nisan. And the same thing is with the sheet of Rabbi Akiva that it was Mishal and El Safan. They passed away on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. We bury right away. They were buried on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And again, they also had access to the Ephod of the Potter from Beis Nisan. And they were for sure beyond the 7 days before the 14th. And that wasn't the case of the parsha. Let's read it inside. That's Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak Kaimer, Im Lo Yisei Aron Shel Yosef Hayu Kfar Hayu L'Chayil L'Toyer, because they had ashes from the 2nd of Nisan. Im Mishal Vel Tzafan Hayu L'Shitas Rabbi Akiva, they also Hayu Chayil L'Toyer. Whether they finished contact with the mace when the day they got to Har Sinai, or even if it was Taka Beis Nisan, you have enough time and you have the means of becoming Tar. It must be other people. Who are the other people? When Yidden passed away in the Midbar, so there's a mitzvah to bury them, beginning with their close relatives. Ella, Oiskin b'meis mitzvah. Guys, meis mitzvah here doesn't mean what it means in other areas, that you found, so to say, an abandoned corpse. So you, the finder, you have the mitzvah. Here we're speaking about a person passes away. The relatives upon whom does the mitzvah, the schus of bearing the mace fall initially, they are called, that's here oiskin b'meis mitzvah. So if someone passed away in a way that after you buried him, you right away began the next day, the seventh day count, fine. But there were those people that the seventh day fell out on the 14th. And again, we are following, as we learned in Pesachim, that even though when it comes to the Zman Achilas Pesach, they will be completely tahor. Doesn't matter. It's not enough. They have to be tahorim while the Pesach is brought on their behalf. And that's the pshat that v'lo yochlu lasois haPesach bayom ahu. This bayom ahu is extra. From there, Rabbi Yitzchak is learning it's only bayom ahu ein yochaylim lasois. Holomacher, yes, yochaylim lasois. And for them, the parsha was said that what? For them, the parsha was said to bring the Pesach Sheni. What are we saying over here? Based on Rabbi Yitzchak, we have a new source. What's the new source? If someone lost their relative exactly 7 days before the 14th, the 14th will be the seventh day, giving the Shivas Nikiyim. Burial, start the next day, and the seventh day. If you would not subscribe to ha'oisek b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah, the Gemara in the Kasha is suggesting, and we're going to stand by that, the mitzvah of burying the dead is taka gewaldike mitzvah. But not bringing a carbon Pesach is a mitzvah for which one gets chakaris. If not for the rule ha'oisek b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah, we would have told them, don't bury the dead, don't do this mitzvah, don't become tamei. Make sure that when Erev Pesach comes, you'll be available, you'll be tahor to bring the carbon Pesach. And them burying the dead is based on ha'oisek b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah. Even though, guys, it's self-understood that that's not exactly the oisik b'mitzvah that we are talking about. Because over there, when they had their relative to bury, at that moment, there was no mitzvah of carbon Pesach. Even though you know what's going to happen. If you're going to do the mitzvah right now, even undergoing all of the steps of purification, you won't be taught when the zman chiyuv carbon Pesach is chal. We get that. The Gemara is going to speak about that. But it's linked to the concept that since ha'oisik b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah, that's why they fulfilled the mitzvah of doing the mace, even though it meant they're not going to bring the Pesach Rishon, even though at that time we didn't even have the mitzvah of Pesach Sheni, which would have meant that they would have lost that altogether if not for Hashem giving us the second chance. So be it. Ha'oisik b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah. So since we have that as a source, why do we need to have the source? B'shiftecha u'v'lechtecha. Says the Gemara, we need two sources. We have two sources because we need two sources. Because the Ashmin and Hassan, if the only source would have been the Pesach, the Anachtu Tmeim Nefesh Adam, I would argue that Taka. Why were they allowed to bury the dead? The Pesach. I would have argued because at that moment, they were not obligated to bring the Pesach, even though they know that burying the dead will make their bringing impossible Pesach Rishon, so be it. But in a case, let's go back to the case of the Hassan. He got married, and he's preoccupied with consummating the marriage. And that's called the Tirda Shel Mitzvah. Now comes the time of reading the Shema. Maybe over here, right now, Ema, that he cannot say that I'm going to stay focused on my preoccupation. Maybe he has to make this extra effort because it's possible, it's not easy, but it's possible, unpreoccupy yourself and say Shema. Then he's laughing at my English. So that's why it's tzricha. Now let's go in the reverse. If we only would have learned the din of the chassan, the mental preoccupation by the Shema, I would argue, well, over there, this demand is not brought upon the chassan because taka Shema is a mitzvah saseh, and as the Alter Rebbe points out, it's mu'uva shelo yuchal liska, and if a person, God forbid, misses Shema, but there's no kares. But maybe when it comes to the mitzvah bringing Pesach, guys, this is not before they had the opportunity of Pesach Sheni, maybe one would have said that don't bury the dead. Then, Bizoyin HaMeis, you have a mitzvah to bring the Pesach. You have to have foresight. So that's why you need to have two sources. Atkan, Sricha. Now that we quoted Anomad Aleph, we just wanted to bring a proof that any tirda, mental preoccupation per se, doesn't exempt you from the reading the Shema. It has to be a mitzvah tirda. And the example we brought was from an aval. So Gufa we learned above. Amar Rab Ada bar Zavda in the name of Rav, that an aval is chayiv b'chol mitzvahs amoras b'Torah, aside of tefillin. Not because of mental preoccupation, because since it says Shaharei Nemar Bahem Pe'er, Pe'er means glory. The expression of glory is written regarding tefillin, and you don't, an aval should not go around in that level of glory. And let's get a source for that. The source is when we will learn Moed Katan, we're not that far away. That will be the source of all the dinim avelus, or for many dinim avelus. What happened there is that Hashem ben Nevuah foretold to Yecheskel that his wife sadly will pass away, and then Hashem told Yecheskel that he should not behave like mourners behave, and therefore he should do certain things, including he should wear tefillin. The fact that God told Yecheskel that you should not do what Avelim do. You will lose your wife, but you should put on your tefillin. From there, we extrapolate that an aval normally does not put on tefillin. Chavush means done. Put upon yourself your glory. In other words, at hu de machayvet. This unique hoira asha, so to say, you'll be obligated to wear your tefillin. From there, we learn avakul alme indeed are pater. And again, what we're clearly saying is that there's something unique. There's something unique about tefillin, even though an aval is chayiv in all the mitzvahs, aside of tefillin. And guys, it's not so simple. Fahane mili that he's not obligated to wear the tefillin. That's only on the first day of burial, first day of death. What happens if there was death and the burial is delayed? This is the big topics. We'll leave all these details for Moed Katan, but there's a lot about this. Because then the source of that is, where do we find that there is even a greater, more intense level of mourning on the first day? For sure, the day of the passing is, as it says, Va'acharisa ki yoim mar. And we're using the day of someone's passing as the bitter day, and it's dafke in the singular. And let's leave other dinim of avelus for Moed Katan. Okay, says the Gemara Vayter. Now that we quoted the Rebbe Abba Bar Zavda, another quote for Amar Abba Bar Zavda Marav. Avel is chayiv in Sukah. Now, a couple of technical things. That if someone, God forbid, lost one of his or her 7 relatives prior to Sukkahs, prior to any Yontif, we know that, then the Yontif stops the Shiva, stops the Avelus. So it must be that we're speaking about someone who lost someone during Yontif. And even though the public laws of mourning begin after Yom Tov, and the countdown of the 7 days only begins after Yom Tov, but no one should know about this. But the dinim that are Bitsina, Avelus Bitsina is noig right away. That's what we're talking about. So says Rav that even though he's taking a novel, nevertheless he's chayiv in Sukkah. Why would you think otherwise? Why? And why he said that? He was the one that said that an aval is chayiv in all the mitzvahs. And like we had an Amad Aleph, because there's taka tirda, but it's not the tsar, it's a tirda shol reshus. Why would it be exempt? So Gemara says pshita. Like Rashi writes, we're asking Dafka on himself. Mishnah, 6 lines under the Gemara. Mishnah ha mishad mitzvahs that Ashmi'in and Rav, he already quoted Rav above, the aval chayiv b'kol mitzvahs. Oh, so here Gemara gives a gavaldik answer. The time you would have thought that Hoyel v'Amar Rav Bar Zavda Marav, another statement in the name of Rav from Rav Bar Zavda, that mitzta'er, someone who's in distress. This is a unique din about a sukkah. Someone who's in distress is patim in a sukkah. Now hold on, where is the tsar coming from is part of the puzzle here that we'll have to focus on. Now an aval has tsar. And there is a unique law when it comes to sukkah. Now, this is something that we'll learn more about later, but just to know the source of this halach is based on the concept of teishvu ke'ein toduru. In other words, a person has to live in the sukkah in the manner that you dwell at home. And a home, not a physical house, is where you live comfortably. Uncomfortable distressed living is no living. And therefore, if someone has tsar and they're dwelling in distress, it's not ke'ein toduru. So mitztayir patim in asuk. And this person, hanami mitztayir hu. And here you can't answer that it's not a tsar shel mitzvah. That mitztayir patim in asukah doesn't mean that the distress is coming from a mitzvah. You're mitztayir. But the tsar is coming from the sukkah. Says the Gemara Kamash Milan. No, he needed to tell you that Allah is chayiv in the sukkah. That when do we say, and we taka say, this general rule that someone who's in tsar, someone in distress, is exempt from the sukkah. That's when it's tsara de memela. There is some sort of Rashi taichas memela, not only memela, it's automatic, but memela also is connected that it's an inherent tsar coming from the sukkah, says Rashi. I'm reading inside the Rashi now, 7 lines under the Gemara, that the sukkah brings the distress. For example, it's very hot in the sukkah, or it's very cold in the sukkah, or it smells bad in the sukkah. In other words, that is where we say, it's tired, then you put it from the sukkah, back inside the Gemara. But over here, what is bringing tsar? By the fact that he lost a close relative. And again, listen to these words. Wow. He, so to say, is bringing the tsar upon himself because he's able to remove his tsar. He can calm his mind. How can he calm his mind? By not thinking right now about the fact that he's an oval. Now, hold on. There's something has to be clarified. If the Gemara began to explain that mitztayir is patir min asukah, only if the tsar is coming from the sukkah, why wouldn't that be enough? That's enough, because his tsar of avelus is not coming from the sukkah. But the Gemara is not making that enough. In other words, what the Gemara is really saying, that even if there is a tsar that's not coming from the sukkah, if you are unable to shake it off, we still will apply that abitztai is patim in sukkah. Even though you can counter argue what you're going to dwell in your house, you're uncomfortable in your house as well. No. The Gemara has to add, it's like a double layered thing over here. Memela means you cannot get rid of it. If you have the ability to get rid of your tsar, now we don't say, on the other hand, go into the hot sukkah and figure out how to be comfortable. That we don't say. It's when the tsar is coming from the sukkah, then we always say hamitztai is pater min sukkah. If the tsar is not coming from the physical sukkah, like in the case of the oval, since on top of that you are able not to focus on it or to focus elsewhere and not feel that level of distress, you are able to eat, drink, sleep in the sukkah, not in distress. Yes, it will be like Teshu Ke'en Taduru. Then you will be obligated to do so. And indeed, you are obligated to do so. Let's go weiter. Let's begin the sugya. Hassan, the bridegroom himself. Shushvinin doesn't only mean the two people, the couple that's walking him down. The Shushvinin means his close friends. And really, Chuppah is referring to the residence in which the Hassan and Kala moved in there, at least for the first week. In many cases, that became their home. And whoever went for Sheva Brachas went to that location. The Hassan and Kala were not, kafa kelad here and there. It was a lot more pleasant. And all of that week and everything that happens there is all part of Simchas Hassan V'Kala, which is a mitzvah. And because of that, based on the rule of ha'oisek b'mitzvah, pater ben mitzvah. My tama, mishum deboy lamechde, because they must rejoice with Hassan Kala. Problem is, so what? Why don't you move the celebration if someone got married? Now, here's another important detail, like Rashi will remind us, ein noisim nashim b'moyed. Another thing we'll learn in Moed Katan. Fine, the case over here is that they got married prior to Sukkot. So why don't you move the whole celebration in a sukkah? Answers the Gemara, Ein simcha ela b'chuppah. Chuppah here means a residence. And you're not going to have the same amount of simcha. You're not going to have the same amount of simcha if you're in a sukkah. Okay, so let them eat in a sukkah. V'lechtu b'chuppah. No, another rule. Ein simcha ela b'makim su'udah. Okay, so move everything into the chuppah. You can't do that. Why can't you do that? Abaya says because of yichud. And Rashi says, why is yichud only a problem if you are in a sukkah? It's a technical reason. Rashi writes 6 lines before the bottom of the Amid that in the times of Chazal, sukkahs were commonly built on rooftops. And therefore, you are a little bit removed from the people's comings and goings. And if you're going to have the chassan leaving the sukkah, which is now going to be the whole chuppah, because he has to relieve himself, just for example, there might be someone other than the husband alone with the kala. There might be a violation of yichud. And the solution is dafka not moving the whole celebration into a sukkah, leaving it into a residence. When you leave it into a residence, it's open to the street. And therefore, there's no dinei yichud, even if de facto there's right now just a man other than the husband with her. The fact that it's an open area and everyone is able to go in there, and it's probable that someone is going to enter, people in there don't feel that they are secluded. Rava says because of tsar chassan. It's a tsar chassan to make him move the whole chuppah into a sukkah. Why is it a tsar? So Rashi says like this, that a chassan and kala need privacy. And as we keep on mentioning, the types of sukkahs that were built in the times of Chazal, they were fully opened on one side. And those types of behaviors that a chassan would only engage in, if he feels he's living in privacy, he will not do if it's open on one side. Shahamakim, I'm reading inside the Rashi, Shahamakim tsar upasuach. First of all, it's smaller. Second of all, it's opened. The widest lines in the Rashi. She'ein la ela sholish defanos. This is clearly that if you have a sukkah that like today's sukkahs, that's different. But if it's open on one side, uboish lesachek im kalosi. He's embarrassed to interact with his kala in a way that he would not do so in public. So either yichud or because of the tzar of the chassan, you can't demand of them to move everything into the sukkah. And what's the nafkamini? The sukkah was always going to be open on one side. But there were scenarios where many people became the bnei chuppah, and even when you're doing it on the gag, it's highly unlikely that there will be only another man with a kala. There are many people in there. So if the issue is only because of yichud, then you would demand of moving the entire chuppah into the sukkah. Lamando Amar, it's because of tsar chassan, since it's an open, sukkahs were open, so then you would still keep the din that we learned right now, that not only the chassan and not only the shoshvinin, but all of the bnei chuppah, they are exempt from this. This is not connected to consummating the marriage, because then once the marriage is consummated, the chassan is chayiv to read the Shema. And as we learned in Ksubas and in other places, that even if he did not consummate it for 4 days, there is a limit, and afterwards he has to go back to the Shema regardless. Now,
Rabbi,
yes.
Can you explain one thing here? I don't understand this answer of Abaye, the Mishum Yichud, because even if they weren't in the sukkah, if they're in the house, you still have all these Shushminim guys that are supposedly also potter from sukkahs. So why are you not worried about Yichud in the house if you have all these?
Because the chassan doesn't go down from the roof, so he's much closer by, and it's a lot easier for people to enter. And therefore, this is dinam and yichud. That means that if you are in a room alone with there's a technical yichud, but other people can easily at any moment enter, then there's no yichud. Even though we leave the door a little bit open, that's beyond the letter. But on the roof, we don't say that. It takes time to get up on the roof. You can hear people coming up, which gives the people there a forewarning.
And the idea is that there was only one Shushminin guy. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of them.
Well, not for the whole week. Not Not at night. Okay, weiter. It's important. I want you to know that what? That I eat in the sukkah. And v'chadi b'chup. And let me tell you something. Not only does it not diminish my joy, I have joy by the fact that I'm doing 2 mitzvahs. I'm married, I'm a sameach, chassan v'kala, and I'm doing the mitzvah. Why? The vidna tarte, gevaldik, the mean inside Rashi, shtei mitzvahs, sukkah mitzvahs nesuyin. Now, when did he get married? Rashi is where Rashi writes it out. He got married erev haregel. But toich haregel, you can't get married, as we learn in Moed Katan, the einois noshim b'moed. In other words, this becomes subjective. When you're telling that you don't want to bring tzad, and I'm at stayed part of minasuka, itaka, we know today you can argue both ways. Some people say, I don't have to sleep in the sukkah because mitzvah. Other people say, why are you mitzvah? You should be happy that you're fulfilling a mitzvah. Okay, and now it's important. I want to learn weiter because Rashi, unlike other Rishonim, were in the second to last line, clearly hold that this Tana rejects the ganze oisik b'mitzvah patur ben mitzvah. Yet, even if you don't subscribe to oisik b'mitzvah patur ben mitzvah, yet on the Rabbanon, Hassan, and the Shushvinen, and not only the Shushvinen, but the Bnei Achupa, they are exempt from Tefilla. That's a new din. Not because you're not, because you cannot, because you are unable to do Tefilla. Generally, mitzvahs, of course, be focused on the mitzvah. But if you didn't focus on the mitzvah, you fulfill the mitzvah. Prayer, if you don't have the minimum amount of kavanah, you don't do the mitzvah. It's because you are unable to do it. Oh, the boy kavanah, back. And they are exempt of tefillin, not because they're oisik b'mitzvah, but because since de facto in that environment people are drinking and there's a lot of levity, says Rashi, the shchicha shichrus, the kalus roish, one may not be in that state, so you prevent people violating the kedusha of tefillin. Don't put it, last line in Rashi, because even though krishma like tefillah demands kavanah, but by tefillah, by the level of kavanah that you're standing in front of God, you have to have for the whole Shemona Esrei. Even knowing the meaning of every word, you have to have for the first bracha. That's a lengthy kavanah. Krishma only demands minimally for the first pasuk. The mitzvah's kavanah, says Rashi, Einoi Ela B'Pasuk Rishon. For that, the Yecholim liyashev datum shaktana k'dei likra pasuk Rishon. Now, if you subscribe Chevra to ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur ben mitzvah, we wouldn't say that. This Braisa doesn't hold to ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur ben mitzvah. So the reason why we have these exemptions is because you are unable, mitzvahs that demand kavanah. So when it comes to Shema, we say you are able. You are able. Focus on the mitzvah of Shema. Daf Chavav. Umishum Rab Sheila Amru, that Hassan, only the Hassan is patur, and we are dafka speaking, my friends, about Kriya Shema. But the Shushvinen and the Bnei Achupa, they're going to be chayiv. They're going to be chayiv. So he argues with the Tanakama who says that everyone is chayiv. Rab Sheila says the Chassan is patur. And again, read inside the Rashi. Mishum Rab Sheila Amar Chassan patur mikriya Shema the tarid, the Shar Bnei Chupa chayavim, and the lace lohu lahani tanoi. Side Rab Sheila, side the Tanakama, they do not subscribe to ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur ben mitzvah. It's very important, this. In other words, if you would subscribe to ha'oisik b'mitzvah mitzvah, you wouldn't say that they're chayiv because they're ha'oisik b'mitzvah. Are they able to focus on Shema? Yes, but they're not obligated to do so. Only if you don't subscribe to ha'oisik b'mitzvah patur ben mitzvah. Yet, the mitzvahs that demand kavanah, which is tefillah, is something that you're going to be exempt from. So I be exempt from Shema. Again, we have this concept that since the minimum obligation of having kavanah is only during the first pasuk, going back, just quoting the Tosfos we learned in Brachas, halacha l'maisa, that if a person nowadays reads the Shema and they realize after they read the Shema that their mind was not there, they have to repeat the Shema. If a person davens the Shemona Esrei and they were not having the minimum amount of kavanah while they were saying the Shemona Esrei, theoretically they have to repeat the Shemona Esrei, but practically they do not do so, because who says you'll have kavanah the second time around, and that will be a bracha levatala? No, there's something unique about the Shema simply because of its brevity that enables even people with a lesser of a mental power to make the effort and have kavanah. And since, again, Rashi, both of the Tanoim hold that this Tana does not subscribe, these Tanoim don't subscribe to ha'oisik b'mitzvah mitzvah, so therefore there's a chiyuv of Kriya Shema. The only question is, who are you being mechayev? And Rashi and Rab Sheila holds that the Chassan is so preoccupied that you can't demand of him to have kavanah even for the pasuk rishon, so the Chassan is patur. To be continued.
Yeah.